Welcome to the Power and Excellence podcast.
You're listening to The Unseen Advantage, part of the Power in Excellence podcast series.
Hello and welcome. This is indeed the Power and Excellence podcast, and welcome to this episode 8 of The Unseen Advantage, our special series where we're exploring the secret psychology of leadership. And today we're talking about something that affects every decision you've ever made, every product you've ever bought, every leader you've ever followed, every political opinion you've ever held. In fact, it impacts every relationship you've entered, every meeting you've sat through, and every social media post you've ever liked. And yet, most people barely notice it. Today, we're talking about influence. Not manipulation or coercion, not even persuasion. Influence, the invisible force that quietly shapes human behavior. I'll be right back.
Leadership is learned. It's a wonderful and beautiful skill. The Power and Excellence podcast is where leaders grow.
Now, before we go any further, let me ask you a question. How influenced do you think you are? Most people answer the same way. Most people think less than average, which is fascinating because statistically that can't be true, right? We can't all be less influenced than average. In fact, one of the most reliable findings in psychology is that people consistently underestimate how much influence they're under. We see influence as something that happens to other people, never ourselves. It's the reason why we can laugh at a stranger who falls for a scam whilst simultaneously believing an advert that claims a $300 face cream somehow contains the secret to eternal youth. It's why people watch documentaries about cults and think, yeah, I'd never fall for that. And it's why highly intelligent executives can walk into a boardroom convinced that they're making rational decisions while being unconsciously guided by forces they haven't even noticed. And today we're beginning with an executive that we met earlier in this series, Sarah, the CEO. Sarah's bright, she's experienced, she's analytical, and she's built a reputation for making calm, evidence-based decisions. People trusted her judgment, and perhaps more importantly, she trusted her own judgment. And this is where our story begins. It was a Monday morning. The executive team had gathered around a polished conference table, and on the agenda was a proposed acquisition of a smaller competitor. The finance director presented the numbers. The strategy director spoke enthusiastically about market share. The ops director described the synergies, and the board chair appeared supportive. As the discussion unfolded, Sarah felt quietly uneasy. The valuation seemed high. The integration risks looked significant. Something just didn't feel right to her. Yet, one by one, every executive voiced their support. The atmosphere in the room shifted and confidence grew, momentum gathered, and people started to get excited. By the end of the meeting, Sarah found herself supporting the acquisition. But driving home that night, she reflected on the discussion. She told herself that the evidence had convinced her, that logic had won, the arguments had been persuasive. But had they? Had they really? Or had something else happened? To answer that question, we need to travel back in time to the 1950s and one of the most famous experiments in psychological history. Psychologist Solomon Asch wanted to study conformity. His experiments appeared remarkably simple. Participants were shown a line, then shown 3 comparison lines. And their task was very straightforward. Identify which line matched the original. The correct answer was obvious, super obvious, not difficult. Even a child could have picked it up. There was no ambiguity whatsoever. The participant would sit in a room with several other people. What they didn't know, however, was that everyone else was secretly working for the researcher. The participant was the only genuine subject in the room. At first, everybody answered correctly. Then something changed. The other participants began deliberately giving the wrong answer, one after another, confidently, publicly, loudly. The real participants sat there hearing increasingly absurd responses, whilst the correct answer remained obvious. And yet, many participants changed their answers to match the group. Not because they suddenly became blind or suddenly became stupid, because they were human. In Asch's classic studies, around 75% of participants conformed at least once when exposed to group pressure. Just think about that for a minute. 3/4 of people knowingly agreed to something that they could see with their own eyes was wrong. And that's not failure of intelligence, that's a consequence of belonging. Because beneath all of our sophistication, beneath our education and qualifications, we remain, at heart, at our very core, tribal creatures. And tribal creatures have always faced a difficult calculation. Being wrong alone can be dangerous. Being wrong with the group often feels safer. Imagine a human being 100,000 years ago. Not a CEO, not an entrepreneur, not a LinkedIn influencer, just a hunter-gatherer, standing at the edge of the savannah. If everyone in the tribe suddenly ran, what was the safest response? To conduct a careful risk analysis, to request additional data, commission a feasibility study? No. The safest response was to run, and run immediately, and run as fast as you can. Because if 20 people start running, they might know something that you don't. And the cost of a false alarm is small. The cost of ignoring genuine danger in that context could be fatal. Evolution, therefore, rewarded those who paid attention to the behaviour of others. Social influence wasn't a weakness, it was a survival strategy. And the problem is that our brains still operate largely on software designed for a world that no longer exists. Instead of lions and predators, we face social approval and disapproval. Yet our brains often react as if exclusion remains life-threatening. And this is why a room full of people agreeing with each other can exert extraordinary influence over us, even today. And the fascinating thing about Asch's experiments is that they occur every day in every organization. You've probably seen it happen. You've probably even participated. A senior executive proposes an idea, a few people nod, a few others follow, and before long, consensus appears to emerge. Nobody wants to be the first person to dissent. Nobody wants to appear negative. Nobody wants to look difficult. And the result is artificial agreement, not because everybody genuinely agrees, but because everybody believes that everyone else agrees. Psychologists call this pluralistic ignorance. Everybody privately doubts, everybody publicly complies. Everybody assumes that they're the only one with concerns, and terrible decisions can emerge. The corporate graveyard is full of examples of this. Projects that nobody really believed in, strategies that nobody supported, initiatives that nobody wanted, but all were approved by groups of intelligent people. The most remarkable finding from Asch's research wasn't conformity. It was what happened when a single person dissented. Just one person willing to disagree. One person willing to say, "Yeah, I don't think that's right." Conformity dropped dramatically when that person spoke up. One voice changed everything. Why? Because the spell was broken. People realized that they weren't alone, and this matters enormously for leadership. The best leaders don't create agreement, they create safety. Safety to challenge, safety to question, safety to disagree. Because the moment that disagreement becomes dangerous, influence becomes distortion, and reality becomes increasingly difficult to find. A few weeks after Sarah's meeting, she sat in another executive meeting. This time she paid closer attention. As the discussion unfolded, she noticed something. 3 executives privately expressed concerns before the meeting. Inside the meeting, none of them mentioned it. Not one. And afterwards, she asked them why. And the answers were quite revealing. They said things like, "I didn't want to derail the discussion. I thought everybody else supported it. I wasn't sure my concern was valid. I didn't want to appear negative." In other words, Asch was alive and well in that meeting, and it's not a laboratory, it's a boardroom. If Asch showed us the power of crowd, Stanley Milgram showed us something even more unsettling. The power of authority. In the 1960s, Milgram conducted what would become one of psychology's most controversial studies. Participants were told that they were helping investigate learning. One individual acted as a learner, another acted as a teacher. The teacher's role was to administer electric shocks whenever the learner made mistakes. The shocks were fake, but the participants didn't know that. As errors increased, the shock supposedly became stronger. The learner began protesting, then screaming, then pleading, and eventually there was silence. Throughout the experiment, an authority figure in a lab coat calmly instructed participants to continue. Many hesitated. Many became visibly distressed. Yet astonishingly, large numbers of them continued administering shocks simply because an authority figure told them to do so. Milgram's findings shocked, if you'll pardon the pun, the world, because they suggested something uncomfortable. They suggested that ordinary people can be influenced into extraordinary behavior under the right conditions, not because they're evil, but because authority is powerful. Sarah, our CEO, began noticing authority everywhere, particularly her own. One afternoon, she casually remarked during a strategy meeting, "I quite like option A." Nothing more, no instruction, no decision, no mandate, just an observation. 3 weeks later, the entire organization was preparing to implement option A. Nobody had questioned it, nobody had challenged it, nobody had explored alternatives even. Her comment had quietly become organizational reality. And this frightened her, this scared her a bit, because she realized something really important, that leaders often underestimate their influence. When a CEO speaks, employees don't hear a peer, they hear authority. And the higher the position, the greater the amplification. The casual suggestion becomes a perceived instruction, and the personal preference can become a corporate priority. A passing comment, even like Sarah's, can reshape behavior throughout an organization. So the obvious question here is why? Why are human beings so susceptible to authority? Well, the answer to that is surprisingly rational. It's because authority usually helps. Experts generally know more than novices. Doctors know more about medicine. Pilots know more about flying. Engineers know more about engineering. So deferring to expertise is often sensible, but the problem arises when authority becomes unquestioned, when obedience replaces thinking, when hierarchy replaces judgment, because authority works best when it's combined with accountability. Without accountability, authority becomes dangerous. Many organizational disasters share a common feature. People knew something was wrong and nobody challenged it, not because they lacked intelligence, but because authority distorted behavior. And we've seen this repeatedly in aviation, healthcare, finance, energy, and government. Junior employees notice problems, senior leaders remain unaware. Concerns never travel upward. Why? Well, because authority changes the social dynamics of communication. People begin managing impressions rather than sharing information, and organizations become increasingly blind. And the irony is that most powerful leaders are often those who make other people feel safe when challenging them. Because influence becomes strongest when people choose to follow rather than feel compelled to comply. Around this time, Sarah noticed something peculiar. One of her managers had recently been promoted. Before the promotion, he was collaborative, approachable, popular even. Now, something had changed. He became increasingly controlling, increasingly rigid, a bit authoritarian. And at first, Sarah assumed that it was just the pressure of leadership that had changed him a little. Then she began wondering whether something else had happened. What if the role itself was influencing behavior? Psychology offers an intriguing answer here, and it takes us to one of the most famous and controversial studies ever conducted. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted the now famous Stanford prison experiment. Students were randomly assigned roles as prisoners or guards in a simulated prison environment. What followed became legendary. Participants rapidly began behaving in ways consistent with their assigned roles. Some guards became increasingly authoritarian, some prisoners became passive and distressed. The study was even terminated early due to concerns about participant welfare. For decades, the experiment was cited as evidence that situations and roles can profoundly influence behavior. More recently, researchers have criticized aspects of the methodology and interpretation, arguing that the findings might not be as straightforward as originally believed. Nonetheless, the study remains historically influential because it highlighted the power of social roles and expectations. The lesson isn't necessarily that people become monsters when given authority. The lesson is perhaps a bit more subtle than that. That roles influence behavior, titles influence behavior, even expectations influence behavior. And crucially, identity influences behavior. So let's think for a minute about how this often happens. Somebody becomes a manager and suddenly they behave differently. Somebody becomes a police officer and begins seeing the world differently. Somebody becomes a politician and starts speaking differently. And somebody becomes a CEO and starts thinking differently. Part of this is experience, part of it is expectation, and part of it is influence. The role begins to shape the person. And this raises an important question. Are we influencing the role, or is the role influencing us? Well, the answer is often both. Let's go back to Sarah. The more Sarah reflected on leadership, the more she realized something. that people rarely behave according to objective reality. They behave according to perceived reality. And this is something that we have discussed many times on this series, that perception creates meaning, identity shapes behavior, and influence shapes perception. These aren't separate psychological phenomena. They're deeply interconnected. Influence changes perception, perception changes identity, identity changes behavior, behavior reinforces identity. And the loop continues, usually unnoticed. If influence has a founding father, it may well be a man called Edward Bernays. And his story is one of the most important and perhaps disturbing in modern history. Bernays was the nephew of a rather famous man. You probably heard of him, Sigmund Freud. And while Freud explored the unconscious mind, Bernays became fascinated by something else. How to influence masses of people. He recognized that human beings rarely make decisions based purely on logic. They make decisions based on emotions, identity, status, and symbolism. In other words, the things beneath conscious awareness. Bernays would go on to become one of the founders of modern public relations, and in doing so, he changed the world. One of his most famous campaigns involved cigarettes. At the time, smoking among women was socially frowned upon, and this limited cigarette sales. So Bernays reframed smoking not as a habit, but as a symbol of freedom and empowerment. He arranged for women to publicly smoke cigarettes during a New York parade, branding them torches of freedom. Genius. And the campaign generated enormous publicity. Smoking among women subsequently increased, and Bernays demonstrated something profound. People don't buy products, they buy meanings, and those meanings can be engineered. This insight transformed advertising forever. Before Bernays, advertising often focused on product features. After Bernays, advertising increasingly focused on identity. Not, this car has excellent engineering, but this car says something about who you are. This watch doesn't just tell the time, this watch signals status. This phone makes calls like every other phone does, but this phone reflects your lifestyle. Bernays understood something many businesses still fail to grasp, that human beings are emotional creatures who use logic to justify emotional decisions, and influence often works most effectively when it speaks to identity rather than to reason. One of the most common myths about influence is that somehow intelligence protects us from it. Oh, if only that were true. In fact, if anything, intelligence can make us even more vulnerable to influence. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but psychologists have repeatedly found that intelligent people are exceptionally good at explaining decisions after they've made them. And unfortunately, that's not the same as avoiding poor decisions in the first place. Imagine a lawyer defending their client. Their job isn't to determine the truth, it's just to build the strongest possible argument. And much of human reasoning works in a remarkably similar way. We make a decision, then our intelligence gets to work explaining why that was the right thing to do. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt famously compared this process to a rider sitting on top of an elephant. The rider might believe that they are in control of where they go, but the elephant has other ideas. Most of us imagine our decision-making follows a very neat sequence. We get the facts, we analyze them, and we make a decision. The reality, unfortunately, is closer to we have a feeling, we make a decision, and then we justify that decision. And influence understands this better than we do, because influence rarely attacks logic directly. It speaks to identity, it speaks to our sense of belonging, our status, our fears and desires. And then it just leaves logic to tidy up the mess afterwards.
Power in Excellence is the podcast for leaders who want more than motivation. Join leadership psychologist Dr. John as he unpacks the hidden psychology of influence, decision-making, trust, and performance.
If influence had a patron saint, it would likely be Robert Cialdini. Cialdini spent decades studying why people say yes. He infiltrated sales organizations, fundraising operations, marketing teams, and persuasion experts to discover what actually worked. And what he found was remarkable. Across cultures and industries, similar patterns kept appearing. Certain psychological shortcuts repeatedly influenced behavior. Not because people were irrational, but just because people are people, we're human beings. And here are some of Cialdini's most important findings. Reciprocity. Human beings dislike feeling indebted. If somebody gives us something, we feel a subtle pressure to return the favor. This principle is so powerful that entire industries have been built around it. Free samples, free consultations, free trials, free webinars, free guides, free coffee, free gifts, free whatever. The psychology is remarkably simple. When somebody provides something of value, we naturally feel more positive towards them. The ethical version of this is generosity. The unethical version is creating a sense of obligation. The underlying psychology remains exactly the same. Then there's commitment and consistency. Human beings love consistency. Once we commit to something publicly, we tend to behave in ways that support that commitment. This is the reason why small agreements are so powerful. A small yes often increases the likelihood of a larger yes later on. And it's not because people are being tricked, it's because people want their behavior to align with their self-image. Nobody likes to feel inconsistent. This is particularly powerful when identity becomes involved, because when I see myself as a healthy person, healthy choices become easier. If I see myself as a leader, leadership behaviors become easier. If I see myself as environmentally conscious, environmentally friendly decisions become easier. Influence becomes strongest when behavior aligns with identity. Then there's social proof, and this might be the most visible influence mechanism in modern life. When we're uncertain, we look to other people. We turn to other people to see what they think. We read reviews, we check ratings, we look at testimonials, we ask our friends, and we see what other people are doing. This shortcut generally works extremely well. If hundreds of other people are recommending a restaurant, it's probably worth considering. If thousands of customers on Amazon report positive experiences, that information has value. The problem arises when popularity becomes a substitute for thinking. And history is full of examples where huge numbers of people were convinced of things that later proved disastrously wrong. Markets, politics, social environments, business trends. Then we have the rise of the influencer. Sarah, our CEO friend, encountered the modern version of social proof at home when her daughter wanted an expensive skincare product. Very expensive. So Sarah did what we would each do in her place. She researched the ingredients, nothing extraordinary there. She looked at the science, nothing revolutionary. And yet millions of units were being sold. Why? Because a social media influencer had recommended it. Or rather, because millions of people felt they knew that influencer. And this is where influence becomes quite fascinating and possibly even slightly disturbing. Psychologists call this phenomenon parasocial relationship, the friend who doesn't know that you even exist. It's a one-sided relationship where one person feels connected to somebody who has no awareness of them. TV presenters, for example, radio hosts, actors, social media creators, all of these people create these parasocial relationships. Followers watch their lives unfold. They hear about relationships. They hear about their families, watch their failures, their victories, their struggles. Over time, something really interesting happens. The influencer begins to feel familiar, and that familiarity creates trust. The relationship feels authentic, even though it exists entirely on one side. And this explains why a teenager with a smartphone can sometimes outperform a multinational advertising campaign. The advertising says, "Trust our company." Influencers say, "Trust me." And psychologically, that's a very, very different proposition. One of the great ironies of the modern economy is that authenticity has itself become a commercial asset. The most successful influencers often appear relatable. They're unpolished, they're real, they're human, they make mistakes. Their vulnerabilities become part of their appeal. Their imperfections become part of their brand. And I'm sure that many of those vulnerabilities and imperfections are carefully curated. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're dishonest. Many are genuinely authentic. But it does mean that authenticity has become one of the most valuable forms of influence in existence. People trust people far more readily than they trust institutions, and social media has scaled that reality to extraordinary levels. Social media companies compete for one thing: attention. The longer users remain engaged, the more opportunities exist to generate revenue. The question therefore becomes, what captures attention? Well, unfortunately, the answer isn't always truth or nuance or wisdom. Often it's emotion. It can be fear, outrage, conflict, validation. Algorithms have quickly learned how to keep us engaged, and they give us more of what we want. This doesn't necessarily happen because somebody's trying to manipulate us. It happens because engagement is measurable, and measurable outcomes tend to become optimization targets. The result is a world where influence has become automated. It has become scaled, personalized, and continuous. Part of social media's power comes from intermittent reinforcement, the same principle that makes gambling so compelling. Most rewards are unpredictable. Occasionally, something fascinating happens. Maybe we get a funny video, a valuable insight, an exciting update, a burst of validation. The unpredictability is what keeps us engaged. That's why we keep scrolling, we keep checking, we keep refreshing, searching for the next reward. The smartphone has become one of the most sophisticated behavioral influence devices ever created. Not because it's malicious, because it understands human psychology, sometimes better than we do.
You're listening to the Power and Excellence podcast with Dr. John.
Now let's talk about one of the most disturbing events in modern history, one of the darkest lessons in influence, Jonestown. In 1978, in the South American country of Guyana, more than 900 people died following the instructions of cult leader Jim Jones. How could that possibly happen? How could ordinary people follow another human being so completely? Well, the answer is normality. Most followers weren't irrational extremists. They were idealistic. They were compassionate. They were hopeful. They wanted community. They wanted meaning, purpose, and connection. The very things that attract people to organizations, movements, and causes every single day. Nobody joins a cult. People join a community. The cult really comes later. And that might be the most unsettling lesson in influence psychology. Jones didn't begin by demanding total obedience. He began by creating belonging, a shared mission, a shared identity, a shared sense of purpose, and that then gradually grew. Small commitments became larger commitments. Loyalty became expected. Questioning became uncomfortable. Criticism became a betrayal. And the group identity gradually became stronger than individual identity. Alternative viewpoints became increasingly scarce, the outside world became the enemy, and the inside world became reality. And what makes Jonestown so disturbing isn't the ending, it's the process. Because the process was gradual, it was incremental, it was psychologically understandable. And that forces us to confront a very uncomfortable truth. The same mechanisms involved in extreme influence exist in ordinary life. Authority, social proof, commitment, identity, belonging, and so on. These are not exotic psychological forces. They're everyday human forces, which is precisely what makes them powerful. When we think about our CEO, Sarah, by now her understanding of leadership has changed completely. She no longer views leadership as directing people. She views leadership as influencing people. And influence, she realizes, rests on trust. Trust isn't soft. Trust isn't optional. It's a force multiplier. Without trust, influence feels like pressure. With trust, influence feels like guidance. This brought her back to our Rice model of trust: reliability, integrity, competence, empathy, and vulnerability. The more these elements increased, the easier influence becomes. Not because people are being controlled, but because they're choosing to follow. And the same applies in sales. The most influential salespeople rarely sound like salespeople. They sound like trusted advisors. The best sales conversations don't force conclusions. They facilitate discovery. People defend conclusions they reach for themselves far more strongly than conclusions imposed upon them by other people. Influence isn't about pressure. It's about helping people to make sense of uncertainty. Experienced negotiators understand something that many people miss, that influence isn't created by winning arguments, it's created by understanding motivations. Questions often influence more effectively than statements. Curiosity often influences more effectively than certainty. The person asking the most insightful questions is frequently the most influential person in the room. Our friend Sarah has changed her leadership style over the years. She talks a lot less and listens a lot more. She asks much more insightful questions and encourages disagreement. She actually rewards challenge and protects dissent. But interestingly, her influence hasn't decreased. It has increased because people now feel ownership, and Ownership is one of the most powerful forms of influence available. People support what they help to create. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the manipulator, it's not the narcissist, it's not the authoritarian. It's probably the person who believes that they're immune to influence, because awareness creates protection. Overconfidence creates vulnerability. The person who says, "Oh, I could never be influenced," well, very often they've missed the influence that's already happening. Let's take a look at our 5 key takeaways from this episode. Number 1, influence is constant. You are influencing people and being influenced every day. Number 2, belonging is one of the strongest forces in human psychology. People will often sacrifice certainty for connection. Number 3, influence is most powerful when it feels like your own idea. The best influence creates ownership rather than compliance. Number 4, trust multiplies influence. Without trust, influence becomes pressure. With trust, influence becomes leadership. And number 5, awareness is freedom. The more you become aware of influence, the more choice you regain. Today, we've explored influence, the invisible force shaping decisions, cultures, organizations, and societies. But influence has a darker cousin, manipulation. The moment that influence stops respecting freedom, the moment that psychology becomes a weapon. In the next episode of The Unseen Advantage, we'll explore gaslighting, love bombing, emotional blackmail, intermittent reinforcement, and coercive control. Because the most dangerous manipulators don't force you to do anything. They simply make you believe it was your idea all along. So, until next time, remember the most powerful forces shaping your life are often the ones you can't see. And that's exactly why they matter. I'll see you in the next episode of The Unseen Advantage or elsewhere in the Power in Excellence podcast series. Until then, look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
Remember to subscribe to the Power in Excellence podcast.